Hi, my name is Olu Osha. I enjoy talking about US presidents. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the increasing conflict and division in ideology between the two main parties of early founding. That's between the Federalists and the Democratic Republican, right? The Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. They were the two main parties that existed, and of course, I've done previous videos just talking about their conflicting ideologies. Now, over time, especially when Thomas Jefferson became president, he was our president, and he was a leader and founder of the Democratic Republican Party. We see that they started to shift in uh, practice, right? Their practice, their exercise of executive power was a little bit looking was started to look like what the Federalists were actually advocating, and so over time, um, a third party would come about. It was called Tertium quids. Tertium quids is actually Latin, and it means the third something, a third something. That's so it's Latin that refers to when two polar opposites exist. There are two polar opposite parties, for instance, that exist. The third something is sort of neutral. It's neither the first nor the second. So that's what tertium quids is. It was sort of a disparaging, pejorative name for this party that was it really splintered from the Democratic Republican Party, but it was accusing the Democratic Republicans that they were now starting to look like the Federalists, that they were adopting Federalist principles. And what were these Federalist principles? These Federalist principles came to be known as the American system, under a guy called Henry Clay. Henry Clay ran for presidency numerous times, he unsuccessfully. But remember, importantly, the American system were really predicated on the principles, the ideology that Alexander Hamilton advocated. By this time, Alexander Hamilton was dead, so he had died in a duel, and of course, he was the one who had the main ideology and the principles, the doctrine, the program of the Federalist Party. And what did they advocate? They were for internal improvements. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. They were for a strong standing army. They were for a national bank, and all these things. The South sort of repudiated. They resisted these things because of their slave economy mainly. They had a slave economy, and everything revolved around that slave economy. For instance, later on, the uh, the the Federalists were mainly for protective tariffs to be able to protect the northern manufacturing, right? Manufacturing in the north, but the slave owning South, uh, they they didn't have these say they didn't have these manufacturing industries. The economy was slavery, right? And everything revolved around it. They realized though that they would be paying taxes one for a number of these programs that the North was advocating for. Right now, I'm talking about tariffs though. In terms of why did the South resist tariffs? Well, because they felt that if they imposed tariffs on European goods, then the European governments would retaliate by, levying high taxes on their agricultural products, their cotton, right? And the other thing is that the South, they also imported, finished products from Europe, right? Like iron and textiles, finished textiles. And so because they had a lavish lifestyle, they liked luxury from Europe, and they liked the fashionable styles of Europe, and so they didn't want these retaliatory taxes from Europe, which they felt that the protectionist tariffs, which the North wanted, would instigate. So another thing that they resisted was standing armies. They didn't want standing armies because they advocated state militias, right? So they had these huge slave plantations. But how were they able to suppress insurrections? By having these militias. They had their white men, with arms, who patrolled the environment. So they were able to, you know, focus more on they wanted to focus more on their own state militias, right? So that they could suppress any potential slave insurrections, right? As opposed to a standing central army that could, it would take a long time, for them to be able to come and help and assist and all that. Meanwhile, the Federalists wanted a strong standing army to be able to suppress the potential for uh, armed insurrections by state governments. And these things happened. For instance, there was the Shays Rebellion, a whiskey rebellion, that occurred in Pennsylvania and some parts of New England when George Washington was president. And Alexander Hamilton had actually ridden ahead of, an army to go and suppress these rebellions. So these were the conflicting programs that these parties had. And so a third party came called, Tertium quids. And Tertium quids, they actually were founded by, their leader was a guy called John Randolph. And John Randolph was actually a cousin of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's mother was from the Randolph family. So it was a prominent family in Virginia. They were sort of like a Virginian arist- aristocrats, if you could call them that. So, in any event, I was talking about internal improvements as well. Internal improvements was the name that was used for. It's a name that's used uh, for public works to develop roads, canals, and turnpikes and things like that. And the Federalists wanted the money to come from the federal government. Now, the South, however, resisted these internal improvements because they thought that most of the taxes would come from them, but they wouldn't be benefiting from them because, again, the economy really revolved around, slavery. And so they didn't see the benefits to them, and so they didn't want to pay for these internal improvements. Now, amongst the internal improvements and what he called national development, which John Quincy Adams advocated when he was president, was he wanted the building of a national establishment of a national university that would train and develop future leaders. Something else he also wanted was uh, he wanted the building of a naval academy, right? And in the to look like West Point, the military academy we already had, in New York, the West Point. So he advocated, proposed the development of a naval academy, a national university, and he also proposed uh, the build, federal funding for scientific expeditions and an observatory, so for the acquisition and the spread of knowledge. Now, he was a man of, John Quincy Adams was a man ahead of his times because he didn't get any of these things he was advocating for. But later on, during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who was very influential, and he was able to exercise uh, a robust power as executive, a man came along, or well, a man passed on. His name was James Smithson. He was a British man, and he uh, he left his estate to Washington to build an institution that he required that they call it the Smithson Institute or institution. It would be named after him, and he was giving it to the U.S. government that they should, that's his estate, to the U.S. government for the acquisition of knowledge and spread of knowledge. And so everybody knows of the Smithsonian Institute today. And so eventually, after a lot of maneuvering and back and forth, um, the U.S. government and passing with approval from Congress, they were able to get the estate of James Smithson. James Smithson was British. He was actually a naturalized British, right? He was born in France, and he naturalized as a British citizen, and he graduated from Oxford. And he never married, never had children. He was an actually notable scientist, right? He was, uh, he was a noted scientist, prominent scientist in his time. He came from an aristocratic family. He was actually the legitimate child of the Duke of Northumberland. I think his name was Henry Smithsonian originally or something. But and his mother was also an aristocrat. She was the widow of an aristocrat, and she married another person who was wealthy as well. So he inherited great wealth, and he spent his life as a scientist. That's James Smithson. He never married, and so he left his wealth, his estates, to the U.S. government, even though he had never set foot in the United States. So it's funny what a lot of immigrants. I call him an immigrant. He was an immigrant in death. What you call that? You call it a post-mortem immigrant, right? Because after his death, I guess because of his great endowment to the United States government, he died in Italy. But many years after his death, I think during the time of President Teddy Roosevelt, they had his body exhumed in Italy and brought back to the United States, where it was entombed. And so it's in a sarcophagus in the Smithsonian Institute, which of course is named, the Smithsonian is named after him, and he endowed it back in the 1830s, antebellum era, when the U.S. obtained the funding from him, from his estate. It came up to about almost $1 million in gold sovereigns. That's gold coins, which the U.S. government received. That's over $500,000, which is a lot, right, in gold coins. And of course his scientific papers and all that. And the Smithsonian Institute today is the largest museum in the world. So that's thanks to an immigrant that never lived in America until his death. So you see, this nation has strong ties to immigrants and knowledge. So that's what that's what immigrants have been doing for America for a long time. So that's James Smithson. And it's interesting that John Quincy Adams, he was a visionary president, and again, like I said, he had these great ideas for the nation, for the propagation of knowledge and acquisition of knowledge, and the development of a university for leadership training. Although he didn't achieve these things, as president during his presidency, but these are things that America would now become foremost for later on. And so that's part of internal improvements and national development. And this was something that was advocated by the Federalist Party, but usually the Democratic Republicans they rejected it. And it's kind of interesting because the Virginians, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they were erudite men, right? Both of them, histrionomics pegs their histriometrics pegs their IQs at 160. That's both James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. So they were very widely read men. They had extensive libraries. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson's library collection, with over 6,000, almost 6,500 volumes, became part of the Library of Congress's collection after the Second War of Independence. That's the British-American War of 1812. It led to the raising of the U.S. Library of Congress. So Thomas Jefferson was, at that time, he was in virtually insolvent. He was in financial ruin at the time, and so because due to the war, the U.S. the Library of Congress had lost its books, and so Thomas Jefferson offered to sell his collection, his personal library, to the U.S. Library of Congress, and Congress approved it, and they paid a substantial amount for it. And several other Virginian presidents also had extensive libraries. James Monroe had over 3,000 volumes. I think James Madison had over 4,000. Thomas Jefferson had over 6,500 volumes. And these were very expensive, it was something that Thomas Jefferson liked to do. He traveled a lot, in Europe. He lived in Paris. He was minister plenipotentiary to France at the time of the Revolutionary War and subsequently. And so he liked buying books. He bought a lot of artifacts and things like that. And, I guess his personal profligacy led to his subsequent financial ruin, and also the work of being president. For some reason, all U.S. presidents, most of them, again, apart from the Adams family, most early U.S. presidents were left in financial ruin post-presidency as a result of their service as U.S. president, including George Washington, who was a very wealthy man. So this was just something I wanted to just talk a little bit about American presidents and the philosophy, that's the Tertium, quids, and internal improvements, and of course our president's affiliation with the advancement of knowledge. I'll do more videos. I like to keep these tight. I'm trying to learn to keep them tight, as short as possible. My name is Olu Osha. I do these videos on American presidents who I like studying and talking about, and I also am creating awareness regarding abuses in our governments, especially our state government, the state of Maryland. I'm not even from the state of Maryland, but my rights have been abused in the state of Maryland, where I'm being held captive. My family doesn't want me to be here, but I have about 5 university degrees equivalent, and the state of Maryland has basically held me captive for almost 3 years now on trumped up charges. And you think, these are new slave codes that they're using, and they're violating my 14th Amendment rights. My 4th Amendment rights were abused when I was removed from my apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland. It's unfortunate that, what's going on. The media hasn't paid attention to it, and fortunately that's why I'm so much for the democratization of media, because mainstream media hasn't, they don't care. I've sent this out to people. My mother has done so. My family has tried to alert mainstream media on the violations of my rights, on the abuses of the state of Maryland and Montgomery County government. In any event, this is all pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts. My rights are being violated, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.